What's up, snappers? Welcome back to the channel. DDDREWSKY here. We're going to be looking at a brand new card, Toxin, to see if he's worth your precious resources. We're going to be looking at his key synergies, counters, and some decks that I brewed for him. But wait, before we do that, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subs of the channel. I do weekly reviews of the brand new card in Marvel Snap. You do not want to miss out, so hit that notification bell. So now let's get back into it. So now the question is, who is Toxin? Let's take a look. So Toxin in Marvel Snap is a 2-cost, 1-powered card with the ability of on reveal, return your other cards here to your hand and +2 power for each returned. So I believe he has a very, very powerful effect. He can grow in crazy amount of power, which is basically 7, right? A 2/7 on curve is pretty good. And if you can bounce him back again, he could be possibly a 2/14. So I would say in general, he's going to be a staple in bounce. If you enjoy bounce, he's definitely going to be your card. So now let's look at some of the pros and cons about Toxin. So the first point about him as a pro is that he's a potential 14 powered. Like I mentioned, again, if you could bounce him twice, you could get him to 14, which is insane for a 2-cost. I think it's a very, very powerful effect. Another pro about him is that he bounces cards back. We love bounce, or I personally really love bounce, but if you enjoy the archetype, he's going to be amazing. He could either replace Falcon or Beast, or even just add an additional bounce card, right? So again, bounce is great in the current meta. Another pro is that he's another bounce option. Just like I said, you have options like Falcon, Beast, now him. This is great if you want a card that scales in power with the bounce. I think it's an amazing ability. Another pro about him is that bounce is a meta archetype. So right now in the current meta, bounce is amazing. If you enjoy bounce, this is definitely your card. You definitely should be going after it. So now let's talk about some of the cons about Toxin. So he's a huge target to get countered. I would say for a 2-cost, 7-powered is definitely very scary to leave that on the board. You have to be very careful for other cards that can counter him. Another con about him is that he works only in bounce list. So I don't see him really working in any other archetype, honestly, unless you mix him maybe with like collector with discard. Other than that, he's very niche. Another con about him is that potential to get nerfed. I think, honestly, a 2/7 just from one bounce is very, very strong for his card, or for his cost, I would say. So definitely be careful of him potentially getting nerfed, because I could see it happening, honestly. Another con about him is that he's a competing cost with Falcon, Beast, and Black Swan. Bounce in general, there's a lot of, cost and a lot of math that you have to do, right? You have to be very cost effective. And you have to be very careful about the placement of cards if you're bouncing cards, if you're not bouncing cards. So again, I'm just saying as a con is that he is a very competitive cost value. So again, you have to choose between either using Falcon, Beast, or Black Swan with him. It could be a con about him. All right, now let's look at some of the key synergies and counters for Toxin. So the first synergy that I want to talk about is Beast. So my thinking is that you can, throw down Toxin to bounce back the cards that you've already played on the board. And then you could use Beast as a follow-up, right? This allows for you to get Toxin back to your hand, and then you can bounce cards again, right? With Toxin. So a potential, again, a 14-powered Toxin, which is crazy. Another key synergy is the collector. So whenever you're bouncing cards back to your hand, collector gets value. So there's synergy right there. Again, cards with Falcon, Beast, Toxin itself will juice up the collector, so there's definitely synergy there. So Black Swan is another great synergy. She loves turn 5. She's amazing with bounce, especially if you activate her on turn 5. It's beautiful. You can just make sure you have enough 1-cost in your hand, and then you can just dump all those 1-cost with, after you bounce them back with like Toxin, for example, right? So there's a great synergy there. Counters, of course, there's Cosmo. Toxin is an on reveal card, so Cosmo is another factor or another counter to Toxin. So be careful of Cosmo. Cosmo is very popular right now in the current meta. Another counter is Shadow King. That 2/1, is brutal. If you juice him up and then he reverts back to a 1-powered card because of Shadow King, it's going to be super bad. So be careful of that. I wrote down Korg here as another counter just because bounce is very reliant on draw as well. So you want to be careful for like Korg, Rock Slide, for example, cards that can, you know, throw other cards in your deck and then kind of ruin your combo potential. So just be careful of counters like that. All right, so now let's look at some of the decks that I brewed for Toxin. I think they're really, really competitive and fun. So now let's take a look. So the first deck is called a Toxin Cycle. So the general idea of this deck is to generate a lot of power, bounce them back to your hand, and just unleash with the amount of power that this deck has. So ideally you would want to do maybe turn 1 Hood, Rocket, Silver Sable, Nico, and then for turn 2 Toxin to bounce those cards back to your hand. And then ideally turn 3 you can even beast the Toxin back to your hand. With all the energy that you have, you could kind of gauge on what you want to do, right? Ideally turn 2 you do want to have Collector on the board so he gets value from all these cards that get bounced back to your hand. You could even use turn 2 Agent Venom to just juice up this deck. The only card that doesn't want the Agent Venom is basically Beast. Other than that, they're all great hits for Agent Venom. Black Swan is great for turn 5 if you want to activate her on turn 5 and then dump all the 1-cost cards on the board. Iron Man just wins that lane. Iron Man's a great turn 5 option or even turn 6. Bishop value is amazing with this deck as well. You're flooding a lot, you're bouncing your cards back, so anything that you're doing with this deck, Bishop just gets tons of value. So now let's take a look at the second list. The next list we got is called Toxin by Night. I've named the deck basically from Werewolf by Night, but let's talk about the list. So it's a little bit similar to the other list where you're trying to use cards and then bounce them back to your hand, but this one's a little bit more on the disruptive side. So for turn 1 you could do like the Hood, Silver Sable, Iceman, Nico. Turn 2 you could use Toxin to bounce those cards back, or you could use Agent Venom to juice up your deck, or you could have Black Swan just ready to go for turn 5, you know, activation, right? You could use Sage usually near the end of the turn, maybe like turn 5, turn 6. You could also use Beast to bounce back Toxin. Werewolf gets tons of value from this deck because there's so many on reveals. Basically every card here is an on reveal other than Black Swan. There's Hit Monkey value here with all the 1-costs here, and especially with Black Swan. You want to make sure you activate Black Swan on turn 5 and then have all these 1-costs ready to go for Hit Monkey for the final turn 6. Shang-Chi is a great tech to get rid of any of those big cards if you really trying to win that lane, if you don't have like Sage or Werewolf to juice up in power. But overall, this deck is going to be very, very competitive and fun and very disruptive. So now let's look at the third and final list. The deck is called the Toxin Avenger. I named it after Hawkeye and Wiccan because they're young Avengers, right? Run a lot of low-cost cards, generate, you know, power or disruption for the Collector, Bishop. So overall, turn 1, you would probably want to do any like the Hood, Kitty, Silver Sable, Iceman, Nico. For turn 2, you could either bounce those cards back with Toxin. Collector, you could have him on board to get all the value from all the bouncing. And Hawkeye is great because it helps you with curve for Wiccan. Bishop has value because any of the cards that you're flooding with or using in this deck will benefit Bishop. You want to save Hit Monkey usually for like the later turns. Beast is another great option to bounce your cards back with Toxin. So overall, you want to make sure to just generate tons of power, disrupt your opponent, and making sure you're playing on curve with this deck because Wiccan has tons of value in bounce. All right, now let's look at the spotlights that are featured with Toxin. Let's take a look. So the first card that we have is Zabu, which is a Series 4 card. We have Elsa Bloodstone as a Series 5 card with Toxin. This week is pretty good if you don't have the cards. If you do, then I would say more than likely it's maybe a token week for you. But overall, I would say Zabu is great, especially with the rework. He's definitely more useful now in the current meta. Definitely the ability of discounting your 4 costs is really, really good in Marvel Snap. For Elsa, she hasn't been really a meta staple card. She is pretty good with like Kitty Pryde or Athena or Angela. So she does have meta relevance. But at the end of the day, she could be passable, but I would say she's definitely a skip if you don't have her. For the variants, I would say Toxin Spotlight variant is pretty great. I would say for Zabu and Elsa, they're probably skippable. But again, art is subjective, I would say. All right, now let's take a look at the star ratings that I gave for Toxin. Let's take a look. So for competitive, I gave him a 4.5 stars because the meta relevance balance is really, really good in the current meta. So I would say definitely a 4.5 stars. For fun, I would say 4 stars, but again, fun is subjective, but I love bounce. I can't wait for this card. I love cards that grow in power, especially that have a lower cost. For flexibility, I gave him a 2 star because again, he pretty much fits only in bounce list. Maybe there's some experimentation that could be done, but I would say overall, he's gonna thrive in bounce list. For future changes, I gave him a 3 star because we'll see. I guess it really depends on how much, if he pops off. If he does really, really well, I could definitely see him being nerfed. So you want to be careful. You're going to need to know that he could potentially get nerfed. And it's probably a high chance of him getting nerfed, honestly. All right, now let's take a look at my final review of Toxin. Let's see if he's a snap or skip. Let's take a look. So I say snap on Toxin. I believe he's a very, very good and competitive card and very fun. If you enjoy bounce, he's a must-have. That power scaling is crazy. I would say he's definitely one of the best cards of this month. If you're saving up resources, definitely go get him. But let me know your thoughts on Toxin, if you're going to be getting him or not. Any type of synergies or decks that I haven't really mentioned, let me know in the comments below. And make sure, if you haven't yet, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subs of the channel, so I would love for you to be a part of it. And I'll see you guys on the next Snap or Skip. Happy snapping.